5 years ago, I joined Adapt, and this was actually the first event I worked on with Adapt. In fact, I think it formed part of my interview, Jim, didn't it? Building the agenda, I think, pretty much. But anyway, so a few years ago. But I've been covering this market now for a very long time, and I was reminiscing that I started off as an analyst actually 33 years ago covering storage. And I've kind of been embedded in this ever since. So I kind of looked at the survey findings last week, built the content. Then, of course, we had a slight outage on Friday. So I kind of sort of reassessed some of the content, not to dive into that in any great detail, but as I went through everything, there were 3 words which really stood out to me as I sort of thought about what happened on Friday globally. And this was modernisation, collaboration, and resilience. And you'll see as we go through some of the findings from the survey, there's a real big focus on modernisation. There's a need to improve collaboration. Ultimately, as we do those things, we will, by default, start to improve our overall resilience within the organisation. So that's what I'm going to hone into pretty much today. And as many of you know, I do tend to like starting my sessions with a bit of a quote. And I actually found a different quote as well after Friday, by the way. But this is a quote from a former US statesman. Do you remember when we had statesmen in power? Okay, yeah, that was some time ago. This was Henry Kissinger, who was a Secretary of State through some of the more challenging years of the Cold War, and also was a joint Nobel Prize winner as well back in the 70s. But he said, the historic challenge for leaders, all of us, is to manage the crisis while building the future. So really sort of stepping back and thinking about what we need to do differently to prepare us more ably, if you like, for when the next challenge, as we saw last week, does actually eventuate, which of course it will. So figuring out what we need to do differently moving forward, I think, is more important than ever. Now, get your phones ready, but Chatham House rule. We under Chatham House rule here? Yep? Okay. Don't tell Jim. But if you scan that QR code, you'll actually get access to all my slides, okay? I'll put this up one more time during the presentation as well. But do feel free to take pictures and share them socially as well. But again, I'll put this up towards the end as we get through the session as well. So kicking off, I normally start with sort of sharing what sort of goals and initiatives are, but I thought today I'll start with some of those execution barriers that you told us were sort of holding you back from many of your initiatives in general. And this is comparing last year with this year. Things which are standing out, probably unsurprisingly, lack of funding, really big focus on overall cost optimization, not necessarily driving us to sort of slash and burn budgets, but really think about how we can articulate more effectively the value of IT to the overall business operations. Talent a challenge, legacy systems, technical debt, driving that increased focus on modernisation. But what I wanted to call out here was that number 4, competing business priorities. And last year that was up at number 1. Now, when we survey all your peers at the finance layer, the security level, digital and data, this consistently comes up as a major sort of roadblock or challenge for us to get things done, that competing priorities across the organisation. Now, I would argue, if we think about the last few days, it's probably more important than ever for us to align around sort of common challenges and common purposes. And I think as we move forward, this need to really ensure resilience across the whole business is going to become a much more important focus for many of us. And talking to a few of you earlier on, that certainly was coming through in those conversations, as well as what can we do collectively to drive greater resilience within our organisations. And therefore, I wanted to also look at the execution barriers, comparing all of you with your CISO or security leader peers within the organisation. You can see here similar things, insufficient time, resources, not enough funding, and then again competing business priorities coming up for the CISOs, just as it does for us at that number 4 level as well. And what I'll talk about a little bit later on is, on the next slide, how we see the sort of, if you like, alignment between cyber resilience and business resilience, because we tend to look at them somewhat separately, but of course they're very interdependent, and we need to consider what we can learn and leverage from our cyber resilience strategies with overall business resilience as well, operational resilience. And this is looking at how how aligned CISOs told us their cyber resilience was to overall business resilience strategy. And I was thinking about this, you can look at this and say, positively, wow, 60% of CISOs believe there's high alignment. But conversely, almost 40% are not seeing high alignment between cyber resilience and business resilience. I think that's a shockingly high number at the end of the day, because ultimately, as I said, if we can align these more effectively, our overall resilience within the organisation can in fact be much stronger. What can we learn from our security peers? How can we work collectively, I think, to shift the needle? We need to see, I think, a much higher level of alignment between overall cyber resilience and business resilience, because of course they go hand in hand. So with that, moving sort of from the challenges and some of the barriers, I just wanted to share those goals for the next 12 months, which you told us were your sort of top 10 goals over the next 12 months. Modernisation and simplification, number one. Consistently, we see this coming up as a major priority. We're always trying to do things more efficiently, more effectively, and accelerate modernisation to make sure we're not being hamstrung by legacy environments and tech debt particularly. Building secure and trusted organisation. Again, that's where we see that alignment coming back to the security leaders as well. And number 6, you can see developing the AI strategy and roadmap. Jim touched a bit on AI and the increased sort of compute we're going to need to actually fuel that. And much of that responsibility will, of course, fall on us to make sure we've got the compute and we've got the processing power and the storage to actually deliver on those strategies. So tech modernisation and simplification is our number one priority. How are we actually doing it? It's something we're consistently focused on in terms of overall modernisation. So we asked all of you, on average, how modernised you felt you were within your organisation. And this was the result. On average, you told us you're about 52% modernised. So about halfway on that sort of modernisation journey. Of course, most of us will never be 100% modernised, even though you see that sort of spread from very low up to almost 100%. Probably aspirationally, that 70, 80% is where we'll be, because we will always have some level of legacy and historical compute within the organisation in general. So we're at that 52%. But again, as I said earlier, we're consistently trying to accelerate modernisation. So how have we done year on year? Because we asked you the same question last year. So this is looking across a number of different areas, a number of different peer groups. But if I sort of double click in here and look at many of you and your peers who were here last year versus this year in terms of that modernisation level, that red line on the top. So on average, we're 52% modernised today. A year ago, you said you were 54% modernised. So we've kind of, even though you can say it's a decline, pretty much we haven't moved the needle very much in terms of our overall level of modernisation within the organisations. And that ties directly back to how many of our processes are digitised as well. So digitisation and modernisation go very much hand in hand for our organisations. So we see this consistent focus on modernisation, yet we're struggling to really shift the needle and accelerate it. Of course, areas such as cloud have been one of those key areas of investment and focus to accelerate that modernisation, and I'll double click a bit more into that as we go through the session. So we think about the challenges around modernisation. I wanted to share with you what you told us were the 3 most significant factors that can impact infrastructure modernisation. And we sort of analysed this data to give a sense of, if you get things right in these 3 areas, typically you're more highly modernised than your peers. What we can see here, with those who are sort of fairly far down the path of public cloud adoption, you're typically 1.5 times more likely to be highly modernised than your peers who are not further down that public cloud adoption journey. If you get consolidation, connectivity, and automation right within your organisation, so we've got very high levels of operational efficiency, we're 3 times more likely to be highly modernised than our peers. The number 1, though, is tech debt reduction. If we can reduce the overall level of tech debt, technology debt we have within the organisation and across our infrastructure, we're 4 times more likely to be highly modernised. And there's some other data behind this which I can share with some of you separately if you ask me, in terms of what tech debt really means and the sort of levels of understanding around tech debt. Amongst many of you is actually, you're struggling to really understand not what is tech debt, but how you can really get on top of that tech debt challenge, which, as we can see here, if we get it right, we can actually accelerate our modernisation more broadly within the business. So that's looking at that. So we've looked at some of the goals, some of the barriers, and these are the top initiatives, if you like, for the next 12 months, which you believe will help you deliver on those priorities and overcome some of those barriers and challenges. So coming back to some of the points I made around cloud, multi-cloud migration and unification, a really big focus on sort of getting a better handle on our cloud environments, making sure we've got that line of sight across our cloud environments to drive those greater efficiencies. Modernisation, no great surprise, cost optimization, and then reducing technical debt. What I would say here is if you look down those first top four, and what I just shared in terms of impact on overall modernisation, all of these four are directly related back to that. So if we get the modernisation piece right, if we get our cloud environments more efficient and structurally aligned, if we can get on top of costs and reduce technical debt, ultimately we will accelerate that modernisation needle. So it's important not to look at these sort of independently, because they're all ultimately interdependent on each other on that journey. So with cloud, as many of you know, we've been tracking the overall sort of level of cloud adoption in the local marketplace for about the last sort of 4 to 5 years now. And back in 2023, if you look behind me, we had what I sort of called last year a bit of a pause and reflect moment in terms of cloud adoption. It wasn't that it stopped or slowed or stopped sort of dead in its tracks, because obviously workloads overall grew, but we saw a flatlining, if you like, in terms of relative percentages of workloads in the public cloud at 38%. Now that's kick-started, if you like, again in 2024 and through to 2025. So this year, you're telling us about 46% of all workloads are in the public cloud, which represents quite a big increase overall on last year. 2025 is what respondents told us in 2023 they expected in 2025, 2 years later, where they would be. And in 2026 is the expectation when we ask you today what you expect the workloads to be in the next 2 years. There's one other area I just wanted to touch on when it comes to cloud in general, and that's the topic of repatriation, which is a very sort of, it can be a very sort of polarizing conversation depending who you're talking to, in terms of how many of you said you expected to migrate workloads, excuse me, back from the public cloud. And we actually saw one of the highest numbers we've seen as we've been asking this question over the last 3 to 4 years, with 17% of you telling us you expected to repatriate workloads back from the public cloud. I would say this is an aspirational rather than actual number for many of us. If we go back sort of 3 years, it was about 11%, jumped up dramatically during the pandemic, then came back down again. But realistically, it doesn't always eventuate to these sort of levels. What I would say, though, is that to put that into context, if we're, say, 17% saying you want to repatriate workloads back from the cloud, got to put that into context that public cloud has actually grown 21% relatively year over year. So the percentages are kind of very much in step. As the adoption of the public cloud increases, so does that expectation that we might move workloads back from the public cloud. So when we looked at some of the reasons why organizations are sort of struggling with their cloud strategies or looking to repatriate potentially, cost typically comes up as one of the main reasons that organizations tell us they're struggling with their sort of cloud strategies. Won't go through all of these in great detail, but number one there, unclear cost forecasting and reporting. I would say we've been asking this question now probably for about the last 2 to 3 years, and that always comes up at number one. We're still really struggling to understand the true cost of cloud, and that's actually the need for us to do that has accelerated significantly as CFOs and finance teams have got much more heavily involved in all IT decisions, coming back to that need to optimize cost angle that I spoke about earlier on. In fact, we see about CFOs are involved in about 70% of all technology purchase decisions right now, highest we've ever seen. So therefore, the need for us to be able to articulate actual costs and forecasting costs is more important than ever. And that's then leading to a much increased focus, as Jim mentioned, on the area of FinOps, for example. So I just wanted to share what we're seeing from an overall sort of maturity of some sort of key FinOps areas. And again, I wanted to compare and contrast us with our CFOs in general, because as I mentioned, we're needing to do a much better job of articulating investments and expenditure to our finance teams. What you can see behind me is ultimately the CFOs are pretty savvy when it comes to the whole sort of FinOps environment. I did a workshop actually with a major sort of food distributor last year, and they were saying to me how they're actually starting to embed people with finance skills and capabilities into cloud teams within the organization. I'm seeing that coming through from a number as well. So as we as leaders need to be able to really articulate much more clearly what we're spending from a cloud point of view, we need to make sure we've got the right capabilities within our teams to actually do this and align with the CFO in general. So that sort of gives you a sense of where we see that sort of maturity from a FinOps area in general.